Okay, so picking up where we left off. So I talked last time about surplus labor time and how Marx is interested in connecting these parts of human life that are not directly reducible to natural survival, such as philosophy, conceptual systems in general, things like love and art and desire, human subjectivity, in a word. How these are connected to this fact of surplus labor. So basically, this labor that is done above and beyond the labor that is actually needed for purely natural material survival and reproduction. So Marx is interested on this very, very broad historical level to talk about how these ideal systems, such as conceptual systems, culture, language, the market, arise historically out of this point of surplus labor. So, reshifting our idea of civilization and of history to see this bridge of labor um, as the transition between purely natural subsistence and human culture, human civilization, human social relations, and then finally philosophy and art and those sorts of things. So, um, that's sort of Marx's philosophical interest on emphasizing labor as this key factor, this center really in history, in human civilization, in every part of the human totality that we can possibly think of. Labor is the center of that as the bridge, again, between natural subsistence and these things that are not quite reducible to natural subsistence. What then happens is that Marx wants to look at economics. So, studying actual real life economics and then looking at economic theories and asking this question: how is labor related to that? So, the majority of economists are interested basically in looking at massive data sets of things like prices and profits, and then trying to find variables and formulas and equations that can make some sense of this massive data. So trying to find patterns, trying to find equations that can calculate or predict, why the market price of a certain commodity is what it is at a certain time in a certain place. That way, you can do things like predict crises, predict inflation. You can craft rational economic policy for a government or rational economic decision making and planning for a business to maximize profit, to minimize risk, these sorts of things. That's generally the goal of economics. And so, Marx is interested in that, but specifically he's interested in looking at how those sorts of questions are related to labor. Now, most mainstream economists generally ignore labor, or they count it as just a minimal cost of doing business or of production along with all the other costs, and they don't take it very seriously. But Marx says, because of this philosophical basis for labor that we've just described, and also because under capitalism, this massive population of immiserated or underemployed or unemployed workers seems like this persistent feature of capitalism that doesn't go away. And no matter how many Harvard researchers and well-meaning government bureaucrats and philanthropic billionaires try to solve this problem, it yet just seems to persist. That there's always this huge body of precariously employed or underemployed or unemployed workers, or workers who are fully employed but are barely scraping by or are seriously physically and intellectually degraded by their job. And so that's the empirical fact, coupled with this philosophical emphasis on labor, leads Marx to say, okay, we have to find an economic theory that can account for things like price fluctuations, profit variations in terms of labor. So that then we can have not just this philosophical idea that labor is important or has this central role in human civilization, but we can actually demonstrate that with empirical data and then use that to actually make more robust planning decisions and predictions and strategies for political organizing based on the actual empirical correlation between labor and traditional economic factors such as market prices, rate of profit, interest rates, and so on. So what Marx then does is go to the labor process empirically, and he looks at what is happening in the labor process in industrial capitalism. And he says, basically the labor process can be broken down into these three major components that are very different from what economic processes looked like under feudalism or under merchant capitalism. In industrial capitalism, the main wealth comes from lots of people being brought together in the same place to work together with machines. And the compound power of this social labor is more powerful than just these people working individually. And the machines that you can use are much more powerful than if you were just a single worker trying to work with a machine. It wouldn't make sense to get a big fancy machine. So Marx basically breaks down the labor process into these three main components: machinery, labor necessary to produce what the workers need to survive, and then surplus labor, labor that the workers work past the point at which they've made what they actually need just to survive and reproduce. So we have machinery, subsistence labor, and surplus labor. So these three variables added together, we get this fourth variable, which Marx calls value. He then wants to show how these four variables can be related in a statistically robust way to market prices, inflation, crises, rate of profit, interest rates, expansion of markets, and all these mainstream economic concerns.